Hello, and welcome back to our lecture on what is cooking. Now that we've talked about what is food and what is eating, as I'm sure you're already guessing, it's not going to be a straightforward answer as we think. For example, I made ceviche recently, and to make ceviche, you essentially soak fish in an acid, so a citrus juice usually, and the fish texture changes as the proteins unwind and denature. The food gets this tougher, cooked type of texture to it. Now, because it's not heated, potentially harmful bacteria and parasites are not killed. So the question is, even though the protein structure has changed, is this cooking even though it hasn't been heated? Open question. We're not here for definitive answers, but we're looking for structures to think about these questions, right? So another thing that sometimes people think is not cooking is microwaving. Technically, you're heating the food, but you're using this electronic source to vibrate the molecules to make them have a cooked texture. Would you consider microwaving food to be cooking? What about non-heat food preparation, like making a smoothie? You're blending up all of the ingredients together. You've done some preparation. You've changed the nature of the food. You've made it easier to digest. But is that cooking? Now, I like to take a very broad-minded view. So if you want to do any of your recipes for your signature assignments, blending or denaturing or microwaving, please go ahead. Like I said, this is an exploration of how we answer these questions. And we're also going to talk more about preservation methods that also help pre-digest food, like like fermenting foods and pickling foods that prepare them for consumption. So when I think about the question, what is cooking? I actually start by thinking about why cook. And as I've already mentioned, there's actually a pretty straightforward answer to why cook. Humans have really dainty teeth and jaws compared to other similar sized body primates. And this is because we do so much digesting of our food outside our body. So we crush, we cut, we scrape, and we cook, which means changing the structure of the food and make it easier for digestion. So if you blend up something or you heat something, it changes the molecular structure, which makes the nutrients easier to be absorbed in the intestines. Okay, so I am a behavioral ecologist, and whenever I ask a why question about a human behavior, I have a four structure type of analysis to take me through all different types of explanations. And I really like using this analysis to explore a question like, why cook? So one type of explanation to a why question is approximate, a causal, something immediately. So when you think of you're heading into your kitchen or towards your blender or to the microwave, whatever, what triggered that cooking motion? And an immediate cause is usually hunger. You're hungry. You want to get a snack. Your stomach is rumbling. Your brain has told you it's time to eat. So, an immediate cause. Another really cool way to think about why cooking is that it's something that we acquire during our lifetime. So, when you feel that hunger sensation and you make a move to go prepare some food, how are you going to do it is determined by information that you've acquired during your lifetime, essentially learning. You have learned over the course of your life how to respond to hunger and how to prepare food, what types of things you consider to be food, and how you're going to prepare them. So just like we've talked about, a lifetime of learning goes into what is food, a lifetime of learning also goes into how you're going to cook things into a food. We can also think about humans as animals and think about our species history. Humans are learning animals. We're very cultural compared to every other species. We're dependent on social learning and cultural information. So why cook is kind of an easy answer for our species history is that humans can learn how to cook. And really fascinatingly, we're the only species that does in any meaningful way. And then finally, you can think of how, because this is part of our species history, how cooking might have benefited our ancestors, why it might have helped them adapt to their local environments, and how it might have increased their ability to survive and reproduce. So just for a quick review, why cook? What's the immediate cause? You're hungry. Why cook? You've learned how. So you're hungry and you've learned how to prepare some food. And you've learned how because you're a human and you're able to learn. And you're able to learn because your ancestors were successful, because they cooked. You're here because they cooked, essentially. Um, Students always ask me which's the right answer, and all of them are the right answer. This is just a framework we can use, and I love using this framework, and I teach it in my class on the human life cycle. So if you want to answer questions like why do we have childhood, why is childbirth so hard, why do we age, etc., take AMP 352 from me. Oops. Okay, quick review again. There we go. So I'm going to use these levels to structure the rest of this little mini lecture here, taking you from proximate, like you're hungry, how's the food actually getting prepared, all the way through how could this possibly have helped our ancestors survive. So why cook? The easy answer here is to, as I said, pre-digest food. And in the colloquial definition of cooking, a lot of people consider cooking to be applying heat to some kind of product that provides nutritive value. And heat actually comes in 3 different forms, and understanding these 3 forms is really illustrative to how our ancestors used heat to cook. So one way that we can heat food is through radiation. Radiant heat is when excited particles in the infrared spectrum are released and excite the particles in the food and therefore cook them. So if you ever put your hands close to a campfire or a hot stove, you can feel the heat on your hands from the radiant, excited infrared particles. And you can use radiant heat to cook by doing things like spit roasting, putting something on a skewer over a heat source. Toasting uses radiant heat, and baking uses radiant heat as well to heat a food product and change its nature. Another very ancient way of cooking is called convection, where you transfer energy from the environment. So the environment is usually either air or liquid. So this includes, convection heat includes boiling something in hot water, stewing something in hot water, poaching it in hot water, steaming things in steamy heat, or if you've ever taken a bath, of course you know how convectant heat can heat your body. And the third type of heat is conduction, when you have 2 objects in contact with another. So this is grilling, pan frying, sauteing, and they all have their benefits, but I have to say I think I like conductive heat the best. It's the one that creates this glorious Maillard reaction between amino acids and sugars that gives brown foods this distinctive flavor. So like the seared surface on a steak, or the golden brown crust on French fries, or the crust on a bread. It's when something touches a heat source, or in this case of this picture, cold source, anti-heat. I guess the heat source would be the tongue in this picture, and transfers heat directly from surface to surface. And to give you an example of how all these heat sources work, I'll talk about my favorite, most impressive way to cook food is a tandoor oven. Tandoor ovens provide all 3 kinds of heat at once, and you can cook pretty much anything you want to in them. So it has radiant heat from a fire that's kept burning in the bottom. And the radiant heat also heats up the sides of the tandoor oven, which then in themselves provide radiant heat as well. So you can have radiant heat. You can have conductive heat for things touching the sides, like you can put naan breads up against the side of the tandoor oven, as you see here. Or you can put hot metal skewers that you've heated in the fire, over the heat, so you get radiant heat on the outside of the meat, the chicken in this case, and you get conductive heat on the inside of the meat on the hot skewer. And you also get convective heat from the air in the oven, so that's cooking the other side of the naan bread, as you see. And they're really creative. Like I said, you can cook pretty much anything in a tandoor oven. It keeps households sufficient in bread. They're actually quite cheap. They're portable. You see this one with wheels. And they also have adjustable heat, and they can get up to 900 degrees Fahrenheit. Really impressive for a a one-stop shop for all three different types of heat in cooking. Now, Western and cultures with a European cultural history have historically preferred a different way of heating, and we'll talk about that in our next lecture on ecology and cooking and how the forests of Europe really gave people the luxury of not using heat sources like the tandoor oven or the wok, as we'll discuss. And Western cultures have historically preferred separating baking from other types of cooking. So this convective heat in an oven, ovens are their own separate things where you would bake bread in them, and then you'd have the hearth in the home where you'd usually have a pot over the fire, and you'd use more conductive heating by boiling things in the pot. It actually made it really difficult to transfer away from hearths to stoves for cultures with this history. And many homes actually still maintain hearths, even though they're for non-cooking purposes. There's still something very culturally attractive to Western cultures about having a fire burning at home, the home fire, the hearth at home, right? And sometimes these fires are even for non-heating purposes. They're just there for decoration and for this homey feel. In a lot of Western cultures, cooking fires have become much more recreational and usually moved outside of the home. So if you're going to cook over direct fire, you probably have a cooking pit or a barbecue to do this outside. And with good reason, there's, issues of smoke and fire in the household with open flames. Cast iron stoves and gas and coal stoves are much safer and easier, and electric stoves are certainly much more convenient. You don't need the gas pipes. But a lot of people still prefer a gas stove in their kitchen, so there's some element of an open flame, but it's very, very much contained, not the way it was. And thinking about cooking over open flames makes you think about how cooking like this was done. And as you can see in the bottom left picture here, there's a whole array of pots in front of that fire. So you certainly can grill and spit roast over the flames, and we will talk about this again in the next lecture. But I want to move on and talk about pots for a moment here, because you can have earth ovens to do convective heating, but pots, I would say more than anything else, were the first cooking invention to really change the world for our species. And I would argue so even more than knives. Pots really are a miracle for humanity. Making this convection heat now possible, being able to make porridge or soup or ferment things, you move from just heating something to actual cooking. So can you imagine a kitchen without pots? Very, very few cultures don't have pots, and when they do, they usually have something else like a pot. So you can do things like, if you're close to a hot spring, maybe you've done this, you can cook things in hot springs, like the Maori in New Zealand, for example. You can put foods into hollowed out bamboo stems and sink them down into the hot water, and it will convect the heat for you, cooking your food. And in fact, hollowed out bamboo stems are still used across Asia. You can also use things like animal products, like animal stomachs, to create a biodegradable pot. So haggis, for example, where you're boiling sheep in its own stomach. You can also use things like leather to make a pot. As long as the liquid level is above the level of the flame, the liquid in the leather pot will keep the leather cool enough not to burn when you're hanging a leather pot over a fire. So there's lots of ways to kind of get around pots, but starting around 12,000 years ago, pots suddenly become very common. And like I said, they allow us to eat foods that would be otherwise indigestible or toxic. So Mr. Warden talked about red kidney beans, for example, and how they can have these toxic compounds if they're eaten in too great of quantities, raw, or they're not prepared properly. So if you do eat red kidney beans, you cook them on your own, make sure to boil them for at least 10 minutes. Otherwise, they do have toxic compounds. But as long as you boil them for more than 10 minutes, the toxic compounds break down and they become digestible. Anyone want to guess what the third largest source of edible carbohydrate in the world is? Number 1, rice. Number 3, yucca, sometimes called cassava, sometimes called manioc. It's kind of like a potato, and if you've ever eaten a raw potato, you know that it's not tasty and it's not really digestible. But cooking transforms it. It breaks down all the starch fibers. It breaks down compounds like cyanide, which is in yucca, cassava, manioc, and it makes it digestible and not poisonous for you. And your intestines can absorb a lot more of the nutrients and the calories after cooking. Interestingly, pots also make it harder to burn food, which is great, so you're decreasing food waste. And if you look at recorded Mesopotamian recipes, from 5,000 to 7,000 years ago, most of the recipes go like this. Take all of your ingredients, put them in a pot, and cook. So like I said, pots can come in a lot of materials, skin or leather, clay, metal, like copper, cast iron, aluminum, nonstick these days. And they come in a whole variety of shapes too, depending on how they will be cooked. So if you look archaeologically, a lot of pots have round bottoms because that way they just get to nestle into the coals of a fire. But you certainly couldn't use a round bottom pot on an electric stove today because it would tip over. And so the shape of the pots is often related to the cuisine, the type of heat, and the ecological constraints of what is being cooked and how you can cook it. But also culture plays a large role in all of these, the things that you learn, what to eat, how to eat it. So for example, the Dawayo of Cameroon, they have special forms of pottery for different people. And they have taboos against eating from another's pot. And you probably are aware of a few taboos in the kitchen. If you go and spoon food directly from the pot, it's a little different than eating off your plate, right? Maybe you get whacked with a spoon for eating out of the pot by the cook. So we also have taboos about eating out of the pot and how it's done. Pots also have very anthropogenic qualities. So if you talk to an archaeologist, the way they would describe a pot, they're going to use words like lips and mouths. So mouths, the opening, lip is the edge around the opening. Neck's the little constriction. Bellies, the rounded middle part. And bottoms. And all of these are very human words to use. For the cooks in the class, you know that pots have a lot of different qualities to them, how heavy or light they are, how durable they are, how they conduct heat, whether or not they're reactive. So for example, copper can be poisonous when it comes in contact with acid, and they have to be very carefully re-tinned, covering copper with tin. Otherwise, if you put a tomato or a lemon in a copper pot, you could end up poisoning yourself. As you know, nonstick pots don't brown as well. Cast iron can rust. And as celebrity chef James Beard said, even in the best of all possible worlds, there is no such thing as a perfect pot. Unfortunately, many humans have the choice of type of material for the pot, and thinking about what they're going to cook and the type of heat source, you can mix and match and combine the pot for the food to achieve your desired effect. And also keeping in mind the social design of pots, mostly related to the types of foods that you're going to be cooking and the numbers of eaters. So if you look at recipes from the 1800s, the types of foods that people are cooking are given very long boiling times. And that's because heat sources often didn't get as hot in home kitchens. And so a lot of foods like, say, carrots, for example, would be simmered for a long time instead of boiled for a short time because the heat molecules are less active in a simmer and will take longer to transfer heat to vegetables. For some reason, the Victorians also always recommended very small pots, and so there was a smaller liquid to food ratio, which also increase the cooking time because it reduced the amount of heat in contact with the food. So the types of foods that you're cooking, are you making oatmeal? Are you making soup? Are you pan frying a steak? Are you poaching a salmon, right? If you think about how you might cook something, even just size of pot, right? Do you have one of these cute little milk pots for heating the milk for your porridge, or are you making a big pot of oatmeal? Are you doing overnight oats in the refrigerator, right? And the number of eaters too. How much food are you preparing at one time? Are you cooking for the family? Are you living in a great hall in England? Because we're going to be talking about spit dogs soon. Not dogs that are cooked on spits, but dogs that actually help you cook. Are you making a pottage, so like a one pot cooked meal? Or a multi-course meal? How many pots do you need just for yourself? Just milk, like I said on the left, this is called a milk pot. It's about a 1 cup size pot where you would heat a very small amount of milk. All of these things decide how you can eat. And I have to say, I'm very partial to this one pot type of cookery. It's a cuisine of efficiency where nothing is wasted. If you're boiling your vegetables in the water of a soup, then all of the vitamins and minerals that dissolved in water are still, you're still getting them into your body by drinking the broth of the soup. And of course, we want to think about the complexity of pots. What do you have access to? How have you learned to cook? How have you learned to expect to eat? Pot complexity really can change the way that food is prepared, and it can change the way food tastes. So depending on how the pot is using the different heat source, conduction, convection, radiant, it really changes the way that the food can taste, the way the food looks like, and the way the food is consumed. So if you think about cooking a steak, are you going to pan fry it? Are you going to grill it? Are you going to stir fry it? Are you going to boil it? Are you going to smoke it? All of these ways will really change the way that the steak tastes, looks, and is eaten. And all of these things require knowledge, which requires us to be cultural animals. Chimpanzees don't have pots. Poor them, right? I like talking about pots as a good example of how we explain cooking. But I want to talk about 3 different appliances that have also drastically changed the way humans eat. So if you think about pots changing the world starting around 12,000 years ago, electric appliances starting around, 50 to 80 years ago, definitely within the last 100 years, have really changed the way that food is prepared and our expectations of eating. Often electric appliances can make cooking simpler, like if you've ever used an immersion blender. Trying to pour hot soup into a countertop blender is a sure trip to the hospital. At least that was my experience. But if you think about something like the rice cooker, almost every home in China has a rice cooker. It drastically decreases the time it takes to cook rice and increases the reliability. It enables families to eat the same meal they were eating before, but much, much more easily. Rice cookers don't work as well with the long grain rices of India and Pakistan, like basmati. They tend to turn a little gummy. But any home that can afford it in India has a food processor called a mixie. There's mixie repair shops all over. And food processors really make it so much easier to create all those delicious sauces in curry. So you might have a rice cooker, you might have a food processor, but I'm guessing you have or have access to a microwave. So usually households have microwaves in the US these days, unless it's a strategic decision to opt out. So people who are into the slow food movement sometimes choose not to have microwaves in their home. And the microwave really changed the way that the US cooked. The ability to heat food reliably and quickly and get dinner on the table in a matter of minutes if necessary really released people in the US from a lot of the labor of cooking, and the abundance and desiredness of pre-prepared foods that can go into the microwave is really telling of how the US has changed from hearth cooking with clay or metal pots 100 years ago to taking something out of the freezer and zapping it in the microwave and putting it on the table. And we could go back to our question of why cook, or why cook with a microwave, for example. Maybe you're hungry, you're going to the kitchen, pop something into the microwave. You've definitely had to learn how to use it at some point. You may not remember how, but even just watching your parents microwave something like chicken nuggets as a small child, open the door, put something in, push a button, and go. But if you've ever put a raw egg in the microwave with disastrous consequences, you're aware that there's a learning component there. We humans are cooking animals. Our biology depends on cooking. It's very hard for people, unless you're quite strategic and determined about it, it's hard to meet a body's nutritional needs on a raw food diet. Our biology has become dependent on cooking, and the success of our ancestors to change the nature of food, to release more nutrients and calories, allowed us to become the species that we are. To have the big brains that enable cultural learning takes a lot of easily digested calories, and the only way to acquire these is through cooking. So just some food for thought I'm going to leave you with before we move on to our presentation on ecology and cooking is, what's your favorite kitchen appliance and why? Which kitchen appliance do you use the most and why? Are they different? And are you more of a maximalist or a minimalist when it comes to kitchen appliances? Okay, see you next time.